Thank you all for coming to what's nearly the last session. I certainly feel like a marathon runner on the last mile of the 26, and very impressive to see any of you awake. Very impressive even to see Peter making it onto the stage at this stage in the proceedings. As a university student, the most exciting classes I ever took were in Byzantine history. And reading the works of my then hero, Sir Stephen Runciman, on Byzantine art and culture, studying about the period of the rise of the new Rome in its new home in Constantinople. It's a bit of history that I think does not often get told here in India. But the age of Justinian is to Byzantine history what the age of Chandragupta II is to the Gupta Empire, or what the age of Akbar is to the Mughal Empire. It's this classic early moment of climax when art, civilization, the building of extraordinary monuments reaches a moment when it also coincides with a very charismatic leader about whom we have exceptional sources, and about whom we know much more than we do for the parade of the very many emperors who flit to and fro the throne in Byzantium. Justinian, particularly, we have the famous image of him and his wife Theodora from Ravenna, and that strong Balkan face and this extraordinary retinue of beautiful women surrounding his wife, the Empress Theodora, focuses our attention on this period, along with the extraordinary number of great monuments, no more so than the great Hagia Sophia, which stands to this day, though sadly for most of us only visible from the balcony these days after Erdogan closed down access for most of us to the main building. Peter is going to give us a presentation with some slides, a PowerPoint to introduce the subject, and then we're going to go and chat and then throw the floor open to you guys. So Peter, take it away. Could we have the PowerPoint, please, technical team? That'd be great. Oh, very fancy. Yep. Look at this. This is a much more upmarket PowerPoint than I've ever managed already.
Well, let's see if it works. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Will, for bringing me over here. It's a huge privilege and pleasure to be in both Jaipur and India for the first time. The reign of the Roman Emperor Justinian, of whom I give you a late medieval English depiction on the screen in front of you, was one of the most influential and powerful rulers to have ruled in Western Eurasia at a crucial moment of transition between antiquity and the Middle Ages. This is why, rather than give you, at this point, the image of Justinian from Ravenna, I've given you here an image of how he'd be remembered in the far fringes of the West Eurasian world in England at the end of the Middle Ages. Justinian presided over a crucial period of transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages, and ruled over an empire experiencing enormous processes of change, which would have dramatic ramifications for the worlds of both East and West. But in order to understand Justinian, I just want to take us back a few stages to cast our minds briefly over the world of the Roman Empire in the years that preceded him. Now, ignore some of the shading, but the Roman Empire, from its expansion in the age of Julius Caesar and Augustus, by the start of the 2nd century AD, had come to embrace a huge swathe of territory and an extraordinarily diverse range of subject peoples, from Britain in the northwest to the deserts of Syria and Egypt to the east, and from the rivers Rhine and Danube to the north to the distant reaches of the Atlas Mountains to the south. Now, the Romans, of course, had achieved this through extraordinary feats of arms, by great feats of generalship, but also crucially by persuading regional local elites to buy into the project of empire, with the Romans delegating a great deal of the business of empire at a day-to-day level to regional pre-existing elites who were granted Roman rights, granted ultimately Roman citizenship, and who ruled much of the empire through city councils, to which much of the administrative burden of empire was delegated. This was a highly devolved system of rule, described by my colleague Christopher Kelly as a sort of Roman Raj, in which, as I say, a lot of the business of empire was done by local elites, and very little centralization was necessary. But this highly devolved imperial system came under massive pressure, firstly in the 3rd century AD. Economic and political contacts between the Romans and the various barbarian tribes to the north of the Rhine and Danube had undermined these people's somewhat egalitarian social structures, had led to the emergence of much larger tribal confederations and more powerful warlords, who from the early years of the 3rd century began to strike into Roman territory in Gaul, modern France, Italy, and the Balkans, increasingly challenging Roman mastery of the frontier zones. But most crucially for the Roman Empire, the early years of the 3rd century saw the emergence of an aggressive new superpower rival to the east, in the form of the great Sasanian Empire of Iran. In the year 260, for example, the second of the Sasanian Shahs, Jaipur I, led his armies into Syria, where he sacked the greatest city of the Roman East, Antioch, and where he captured and humiliated the Roman Emperor Valerian, taking him back to his capital of Ctesiphon, where we're told when the emperor died, he had his corpse stuffed and used as a footstool. The sudden emergence of this new Iranian foe completely transformed the military and political circumstances in which the ancient Mediterranean world operated. Now, crucially, within the Roman Empire itself, this 3rd century crisis led to a political revolution, whereby a new class of soldier emperor came to the fore in order to extricate the empire from the situation in which it now found itself. Eugene Rogan commented yesterday on how, in terms of the modern politics of the Middle East, once soldiers leave the barracks and enter politics, they very rarely go back. And that was certainly the case with the Roman Empire, and after the rise of the soldier emperors to face down this crisis in the 3rd century, the military would dominate the empire moving forward. With the rise of the new soldier emperors of the 3rd and early 4th centuries, the old senatorial elites would be sidelined. The old city of Rome would be sidelined, as these new emperors would rule from the provinces to face down the foes that faced them. Crucially, we see a shift in power and authority in the Roman world eastwards, where the Roman emperor determined to face down the prestige foe the empire now faced in the form of the Sasanians. So from that point on, it became much more common for Roman emperors to rule from the eastern Mediterranean. With the rise of new soldier emperors, we also see a transformation of the religious life of the Roman Empire, with the Emperor Constantine in 312 adopting Christianity. So we see a Roman Empire become more militarized, more focused on the East, and becoming Christianized. Now, the Roman Empire had always been highly vulnerable to developments along its northern frontiers, the Rhine and Danube. And that world was itself highly vulnerable to movements of peoples and reconfigurations of power much further east, in the world of the Eurasian steppe that extended from what is now the Ukraine eastward to the lands of Manchuria. And crucially, in the mid to late 4th century, the world of the Eurasian steppe was transformed by the sudden emergence of Hunnic groups who projected their power westwards, forcing barbarian groups along the Rhine and Danube deep into Roman territory, thus initiating a 5th century crisis for Rome. And over the course of the 5th century, the western provinces of the Roman Empire, Britain, Spain, Gaul, Italy, North Africa, would pass out of imperial rule. The Western Empire would fall, and we'd see the rise of new post-Roman kingdoms, largely led by warlords of Germanic origin. So as a result, by the time we get to the early 6th century, the Western Roman Empire had fallen, and what remained of the Roman Empire in the east was made up of Greece, modern Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, ruled now not from Rome, but rather from the great imperial capital of Constantinople, which Constantine had founded. This was the empire over which Justinian would take control in the year 527. This was still, it's the area marked, as it were, in blue on the map. This was still a vast empire. Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, alongside the Sasanians, were the two great powers of Western Eurasia. But the empire over which Justinian took control was one marked by a profound sense of anxiety and uncertainty, which the Emperor Justinian was determined to address. And he would do so by initiating a reign of remarkable energy, ambition, and drama, one of the most dramatic in the entirety of Roman history. The sense of crisis and anxiety palpable in Constantinople when Justinian came to power was the result of a series of factors that converged. Firstly, there was the fall of the West. Not even the city of Rome was now subject to imperial control. And in places like North Africa and Italy, this new class of barbarian warlords were openly challenging the universal authority, as they believed it to be, of the Roman emperor. Moreover, in the early years of the 6th century, warfare to the east with Persia had erupted on a massive scale. So we have, as it were, a dual crisis to west and to east. External pressure coincided with internal divisions, as the Christian church within the empire found itself increasingly rent with division and dispute, and as imperial law began to break down, as people began to lose faith in the imperial project. And crucially, each and every one of these challenges to imperial authority would meet a concerted response in the reign of the Emperor Justinian. Quite early on in his reign, as early as 533, Justinian would decide to take warfare to the empire's enemies to east and west. From the start, he adopted a highly aggressive stance with respect to the Empire of Persia. This is an ivory depiction of Justinian taking on his foes. But crucially, he's decided to try to project power westwards, taking opportunistic advantage of a series of power disputes around the Western Mediterranean. In 533, he sent an armada into North Africa, where he conquered the Vandal kingdom there, the territories of modern Tunisia and Algeria. The rapid collapse of the Vandal kingdom led Justinian in 535 to send his armies into Italy, where over the course of a much more protracted struggle, he would eventually be able to bring Rome and the more recent imperial capital of Ravenna back under imperial control. By the early 550s, he was even able to establish a toehold in southern Spain, as you see on the map, thereby effectively once more turning the Mediterranean into what it had last been in the age of Constantine, namely a Roman lake. Crucially, at home, Justinian sought to maximize the resources available to wage warfare by taking on tax evasion and lawlessness on the part of the provincial aristocracy. And above all, he inherited the body of Roman law so as to achieve speedier and more effective justice at home and tighter administration. Taking the inherited body of Roman law texts, the legislation of all previous emperors, the decisions of all previous judges, boiling them down by as much as over 80% to create a new vision of Roman law, a new unified reformed Roman law meant to address contemporary realities and crises. And this codification of Roman law under Justinian was so effective that it's now almost impossible for legal scholars to work out what Roman law was like before Justinian, with the emperor and his law commissioners determining the form in which Roman law would be inherited in the world of the medieval West in the centuries ahead, with Justinianic Roman law forming, as it were, the common law of medieval Christendom. Whilst locked in conflict with members of his internal elite, who resented both his fiscal and legal reforms, Justinian attempted to reach out to a broader body of the population by investing in major programs of church building, epitomized by his magnificent construction of Hagia Sophia in the heart of his capital, Constantinople, until the 16th century, the largest domed structure anywhere in the world, by reaching out to the urban population and especially the urban poor by investing in lavish charitable programs. But at the same time, and most crucially, Justinian determined to finish the task that had first been begun by the Emperor Constantine, to complete the process of Christianization of the Roman state. This meant cracking down on religious dissidents, with those churchmen deemed heretics having their works burnt on the streets. It meant for the first time imposing strict, moralizing sexual legislation, with homosexuals being forcibly castrated on the streets of Constantinople. We see the emperor trying to drive out non-Christian elements of Roman society, introducing the death penalty for those who made only false conversions from paganism, exiling other pagans, and increasingly imposing strict legal penalties on Jews and other religious minorities. For some of Justinian's subjects, those at the receiving end of his charity and the churchmen who adored him, he would be remembered as a saint. For those who were at the receiving end of his persecutions, he would be remembered as a demon. But whether remembered as a holy emperor or a demon king, it was clear to all that this was an emperor of unique ambition, vision, and drive. It's often emphasized that the reign of Justinian made a fundamental contribution to the development of the world of Orthodox Byzantium in the centuries ahead. But I think Justinian's achievement was more fundamental than that. In redefining the Roman state as an Orthodox republic, as he defined it in his laws, by introducing structures and substructures of persecution for the isolating of religious dissidents, nonconformists, and the imposition of orthodoxy, Justinian also made a fundamental contribution to establishing the psychological contours of medieval Christendom and the modes of persecution whereby the medieval Christian state would construct itself. Many of the great persecutions we associate with the world of the Inquisition and of late medieval and early modern Europe were fundamentally informed by the preservation, rediscovery, and reapplication of the structures of Justinianic Roman law. At the same time, Justinian would make a major legal contribution to the Islamic world, where his laws would be inherited by the caliphs of the Umayyad and Abbasid periods, informing early Islamic legislation against sexual sin, and also informing the way the Muslim caliphs themselves treated religious minorities. But above all, through his ambition, East and West, Christian and Muslim, Justinian changed the agenda of rulership for those who came after him by giving them a figure for caliphs, kings, and emperors to measure themselves against and with whom to compete. Now, to date, many studies of Justinian have focused primarily on his military adventures. In my recent biography of him, I've sought to bring into play not just his military adventures, but also the emperor's strong personal obsession with religion and his strong personal fixation with law. If we look at his career as a whole, from even before the period as when he was emperor to his dying day, those were his two overriding interests, with his military ambitions to East and West being much more opportunistic and much more in response to the opportunities that presented them. Likewise, through these legal and theological interventions, we often hear the emperor's voice much more clearly than we have often realized in the past. We catch a sense of his obsession with detail, his intolerance, his sense of constant haste, his total lack of understanding for those who failed to share his vision of a Christian empire, and his ruthless determination to save the souls of his subjects as he saw it, even if they did not wish to be saved. And I think the crucial point with Justinian is trying to come to terms with his reign as a whole, the light and the dark, the charity and the cruelty. And I think that sense is summed up, as it were, by the image we have of Justinian from Ravenna, from the Church of San Vitale. We often look at this image, we are mesmerized by the gold, the silver, the radiant diadems. But our eyes only caught by the gold and silver by virtue of the darker fragments of glass that surround them. And I think the same is true of Justinian's reign. In order to understand the light, the gold, the glittering achievement, we also have to understand the darkness of which both the emperor and his age were composed. We also have to understand that this was not just the reign of a powerful man, but also a reign that was conceived of as a joint reign between himself and his wife, the indomitable Empress Theodora, who informed many of the more liberal aspects of his legislation. So one of the areas where Justinian's law was at its most charitable, for example, was with respect to women who were vulnerable, girls who were forced into prostitution, or who were lured into Constantinople by people traffickers. These reforms seem to have drawn upon the experience of his own wife, who as a small girl had been raised in great poverty and herself forced into prostitution. Now, Justinian's reign witnessed a great imperial expansion. The age after him would witness a great imperial collapse. Many of the western provinces would fall to new barbarian attacks in the late 6th century. In the early 7th century, much of the Roman Empire would fall to the forces of Islam, with the Arabs conquering Syria, Palestine, Egypt. And there's often attempts made to try to explain this later era of collapse in terms of an earlier era of over-expansion under Justinian. I think those criticisms are ill-founded. One of the main factors that weakened his empire, for example, completely beyond the emperor's control, was a massive bubonic plague which first struck it in the 540s, and which did much to wreck the finances and the military capacity of the empire under Justinian and his successors. On the screen are victims of the bubonic plague from a burial site in Cambridgeshire in England, showing how rapidly the plague spread even to the fringes of the Western world. Likewise, we often judge Justinian to have been a failure because the empire would later collapse. Again, I think that is to misunderstand the place of these Western reconquests in particular in terms of his broader agenda. For Justinian, what always mattered most was religious policy, the Christianization of the Roman state, and law. And in those senses, his achievement was much more fundamental. He served to transform and codify Roman law and transmit it to posterity, and he redefined how Christian orthodoxy would be understood, and thereby established the foundations of the Christian faith as would be received in the Middle Ages and beyond. But he also left us modern legacies. As I say, I think it is with Justinian that we see the first clear outlining of the contours of the persecutory state, which the medieval world of Europe would transmit to modernity. Justinian would make a fundamental contribution to Islam and Islamic law through the inheritance of his legal texts. It was Justinian, to give one a sense of local impact, who's the first emperor who clearly developed a strategy of missionary imperialism, with Justinian using Christian missionaries as a means of disseminating imperial influence in the Caucasus and Arabia. And it was by virtue of his missionary activity in Arabia in particular that monotheism came to spread in pre-Islamic Arabia in ways that were fundamental for the future emergence and development of Islam. At the same time, through his architecture, Justinian changed the places of worship across the world, Muslim or Christian. One reason why, for example, so many mosques are designed the way they are today is because when Mehmed the Conqueror conquered Constantinople in 1453, he preserved Hagia Sophia, kept its original name, and turned it into a mosque, thereby establishing Hagia Sophia as a model for all high-status mosque building in the Ottoman Empire thereafter. So here we have with Justinian, as I say, an ancient empire, an ancient emperor with remarkable ambition and drive, but one who I think has in many ways left us a very modern legacy.
Thank you very much, Peter. Fantastic canter through Justinian. The source that gives us so much juice about Justinian's personal life and the life of Theodora is Procopius, who you didn't mention. tell the audience a little bit about who he was, and he comes across as a slight creep because he publicly writes pages and pages of sycophancy about the emperor, and then this one source, the secret history, where he dishes the dirt on Theodora lying on her back and having ducks pick things off her. Anyway, you tell us all about that.
Yes, one reason why modern histories of Justinian have tended to be so dominated by the military narratives is that through a remarkable piece of good luck, Justinian's chief general for the campaigns against initially the Persians, but then against eventually in North Africa and Italy, Belisarius, was accompanied by a legal secretary by the name of Procopius, who turned out to be a man of quite remarkable literary talent. And Procopius took advantage of his skills and his eyewitness experiences of these campaigns to write a contemporary history of Justinian's campaigns, and a multi-voluminous history of Justinian's wars. And this established Procopius as one of the four greatest writers ever to write in the Greek language at any moment of its history, alongside the likes of Herodotus and Thucydides. Now, it was long rumoured in the world of Byzantium that Procopius had also written an additional companion volume to these wars, in which he had turned on both Belisarius and Justinian and given away what he really thought of Justinian's increasingly autocratic and tyrannical style of rule. And this work was rediscovered in the Vatican Library in the 17th century. And it was a scandalous, it was discovered in 1623. And this served to completely confuse scholars, and the cloud it cast over Justinian still hangs over him. For in this book, Procopius turns on Belisarius, telling us how he was cuckolded by his wife. He turns on the Empress Theodora, giving us intimate and pornographic details of her past as a prostitute, but even sources that are pro the Empress Theodora admit that she had been a prostitute, so that part isn't made up. And he gives us a piece-by-piece critique of Justinian's internal legislation, explaining how the emperor used law as a weapon of tyranny. Now, this book is incomplete. It doesn't seem to have been meant for publication during Justinian's lifetime, and I think Procopius was writing it to curry favour in the reign of Justinian's successor, his nephew Justin II, who upon coming to the throne adopts a stance highly critical of his predecessor and that regime. So it's telling, for example, that in Procopius' secret history, almost the one figure at court who isn't the subject of character assassination is the next emperor. And I think that silence is telling. So I think in all of these works, Procopius is a pen for hire. In the wars, he's a pen for hire for Belisarius and Justinian. In the secret history, he's manoeuvring to become a pen for hire for the next regime. But the military focus of the history of the wars, but then the scandal of the buildings, has complicated Justinian's legacy and memory ever since.
You talked very beautifully about the nomads coming in and the Sasanians to the east, but we're here in India. It's at this period that you begin to get, do you get Kushan embassies turning up in Constantinople? You've got that one ivory, haven't you, with those people holding elephant tusks that look like South Indians. You have Byzantine coins turning up in Afghanistan and the northwest, and even a little bit in Xinjiang. And it seems to be, and you get some Roman texts arriving in India at this time, known as the Yavana Sutras.
Yes, it's very interesting. During this great superpower struggle between the Romans and the Iranians, the Sasanian Empire of Iran, it's better that I call them Persians as well, but really we should call them Iran. Really, it's the Empire of Iran. The crucial aspect of this competition is rivalry for control of Indian Ocean trade, with the Sasanians, the Iranians, trying to push as much of that trade up the Persian Gulf as possible, and the Romans trying to get as much of it up the Red Sea as possible. Now, the Romans have as allies in this struggle the so-called Himyarites, the population of Yemen, and the Ethiopians, so they get to invade Yemen. Now, in our Byzantine, our Roman sources, the Himyarites are often called Indians. And the Red Sea, as Will knows, and the Indian Ocean are conceived of as a single sea often. And so when Indians turn up, it's not often clear if we mean people from the subcontinent or we mean people from the Yemen. But it's quite clear that there's a struggle for trade, and we have a beautiful literary account from the 6th century of a merchant turning up in Sri Lanka, Cosmas Indicopleustes, where there's a sort of, they're trying to show off to the local ruler, and you have the Persian merchant saying how great the Shah is.
And the Persians have got a better gold.
Exactly.
Greeks have got a better gold
coin.
Exactly.
Who has the best coin? The Roman merchant wins by showing that the Roman gold coinage is better than the Sasanian silver coinage. But actually, the Persians are winning the war in terms of getting as much trade as possible up the Persian Gulf. But
when they're digging Anuradhapura, they're finding a lot more of what they call the Sasanian torpedo jars of wine. So they're drinking sort of Persian Shiraz rather than Greek ouzo. Or
now, one crucial aspect of this is, of course, the Romans are mostly one of the reasons they're trading with the East is, of course, for medica. It's for spices. It's also silk. Enormous, exponential demand for silk on Roman as also on Sasanian markets. By driving trade up the Gulf and also controlling the western end of the land routes, the Persians are trying to make the Romans dependent on Persian markets. So what Justinian does is he sends some Eastern priests or monks, we think they're probably Nestorians, but monks of the East, eastwards, where they steal the secret of silk production and bring it back to Constantinople. One of Justinian's greatest economic legacies is breaking, as it were, the Chinese silk monopoly and the Central Asian silk monopoly from a Mediterranean perspective, and establishing silk production thereafter as a major economic and also diplomatic tool in the armory and arsenal of Constantinople.
And when you go to Sri Lanka, you see all these lined up, the Greek and the Persian coins side by side. There's a real sense of a sea war going on. And the Persians are trying to blockade?
Yes, Procopius, in fact, who's very interesting, tells us how the Persian ships and their merchants will try to blockade the Indian ports to stop Himyarite and Roman vessels being able to get in to pick up the silk. You also see there's also a land-bound element to this. So if you go in, say, Samarkand or Bukhara, you find Sasanian silver, Roman gold, and Chinese string coinage. And when you find these together alongside these silk fragments, that really is giving you a sense of this extraordinarily connected world.
You mentioned the attempt to reconquer Italy and the attempt to reconquer North Africa. Do you think that he was just too sort of ambitious to go for Spain and North Africa and Italy? If he just focused on one, he might have succeeded better? Because he never quite recaptures Italy in the way that he could have, possibly.
I think Justinian, ruling from Constantinople, you think about the Mediterranean primarily in terms of the coastal zones. If you look at the coastal zones, he conquers the entirety of the North African coastline. He's got all of the Italian coastline. He has the wealthiest part of southern Spain. And those sections of the Mediterranean coastline not under direct Roman rule by the end of his reign, along the eastern Spanish seaboard and southern Gaul, are shielded from the rest of the Mediterranean by Byzantine control of the Balearics, Sardinia, and Corsica. So from a Mediterranean strategic perspective, I think he's achieved the most he could probably have planned to. Also, there's a fiscal dimension to this. The parts of the post-Roman West, which in the early 6th century had maintained Roman levels of prosperity and sophistication, are primarily the areas that Justinian primarily focuses his Western armies on. The coastal zone of Africa, southern Italy and Sicily, the wealthiest part of Sicily in antiquity, and precisely that bit of southern Spain that his armies conquer. He doesn't bother conquering territories where it's going to cost him more to try to conquer them than those regions will ever be able to pay back.
And the legacy in South Italy remains for 500 years, or what is it, up until 1000? You still have Greek control of Bari and...
Absolutely, and indeed, to this day, it's the dialects found amongst Greek speakers in southern Italy bear very close resemblance to the dialects of Greek found in Rhodes and Cyprus, which are the most conservative and effectively Byzantine dialects of modern Greek.
And the trulli that you see in Puglia are always meant to be related to Greek building techniques. You showed us that extraordinary photograph of Hagia Sophia rising above modern Istanbul. It's always been this supreme Byzantine building. But is it because that there are just more resources at this time? Is there a developments in science and architecture which hadn't happened in Rome? I mean, this is vastly larger than the Pantheon or anything that precedes it.
Yes. First of all, no Roman emperor after, or Byzantine emperor after Justinian will ever have the resources to build on a similar scale again. And as well as building this great cathedral, he also invested very heavily in particularly church building across the capital as a whole. In terms of his architecture, he effectively turns the city of Constantine into the city of Justinian. So it's the Justinianic monuments that will dominate thereafter. The architectural design of Hagia Sophia echoes that of a church probably built slightly earlier. Also,
Hagia Sophia.
Originally called St. Sergius and Bacchus, possibly drawing on techniques of domed architecture that come from Syria, Sergius and Bacchus being Syrian saints. But where he got the inspiration, as it were, to build a domed church on this scale is not entirely clear. And it pushes to its absolute limits both the conceptual and practical skills of 6th century engineers, mathematicians, and builders. This comes across very clearly. So it is
probably the most eloquent passage of all Procopius.
Yeah, absolutely.
Descriptions of the dome hanging like a golden chain from the heavens.
And listen, it encapsulates both his legal advisors complain, his engineers complain, his generals complain that he's always pushing people to their limits. He has an enormous sense of ambition, a rather less developed sense of human frailty, partly because he's such a workaholic. Whereas again, something that comes across very clearly from the sources. One should imagine also this structure originally was completely faced externally with white marble, so as to capture...
More like the Taj Mahal.
Exactly, to capture the light of the sun. Internally, extraordinary feat of both lighting and acoustic engineering, such that the sound of the Christian liturgy inside was meant to be distorted, such as to recreate the ethereal sound of angelic voices. The sunlight being caught in there to gather together in a luminous bulb, which was meant to convey the sense that the church was the indwelling place for God on earth, where the heavenly and earthly hierarchies converged. But also outside the cathedral, Justinian built a huge equestrian statue, which was almost the height of the dome itself, which had Justinian on horseback on top of the statue, putting his arm forward, ordering the barbarians of the east, the Persians being his chief priority, to advance no further. Hagia Sophia would survive the Ottoman takeover. The equestrian statue would not. It would be destroyed by Mehmed the Conqueror, but here it is remembered in a later Ottoman manuscript. We have an interesting story that the statue of Justinian goes up just after the bubonic plague has first struck the capital. And when Mehmed the Conqueror is having it brought down and smashed to pieces, surrounding Greeks say, "Don't do this. This is the talisman to protect you from plague." This is ignored, and after the statue is destroyed, suddenly Ottoman Constantinople is struck by a renewed outbreak of the Black Death, and the Ottoman authorities have to periodically withdraw. So, had they listened, maybe. But it's an interesting example of how folk memory of that first plague survives even to the 16th century, 15th and 16th centuries.
Peter, you defended Justinian just now against the charge of sort of imperial overstretch. You thought he did as well as he could in the circumstances. But it's very striking when you go around Syria and Jordan and Palestine that you see these multiple ruins in places like Petra, but also all over Jordan, of these churches which are founded immediately after the Islamic conquest. And you get the impression that the Christians who are Monophysite and who are opposed to orthodoxy in so much of the East, were driven away from the empire by the degree of autocratic orthodoxy that Justinian tries to shove down their throat. So, in many ways, can you not say that the rise of Islam does benefit from, because the Christians turn away, he makes enemies, he drains the coffers. that he sets up the empire for collapse rather than further expansion.
Yes, I mean, I think that the two, in the late 6th century background, on the eve of the Arab conquest, the main problems that the Roman Empire are facing are twofold. First of all, massive collapse in fiscal base due to the bubonic plague. We have no reason to think the plague of the 6th century was any less damaging than the Black Death, which in a European context in the 14th and 15th centuries reduced the population by half. This is terrible in terms of the impact on the population, but it's very bad in terms of raising armies and state coffers. We've also had, as Peter Frankopan explains in his excellent coverage of it, a pronounced period of climate change, which has led to the migrations from Central Asia of new barbarian threats, the Avars, who established themselves north of the Danube, who pushed Slavs into Greece and the Lombards into Italy. So that starts undoing Justinian's work. But in terms of his religious policy, Justinian does manage to drive out of the imperial church every opponent of imperial orthodoxy as he understands it. Now, you're right, some of these dissidents will then go off and found independent churches. These are...
Within Persia,
the Church of the East, the Miaphysites, and so on. But one senses actually...
And here, actually,
there's
but migrations of Syriani down to Kerala.
But what people are currently arguing more is that actually in the late 6th, early 7th centuries, those communities are very small. And really they expand under, first of all, Persian rule, because prior to the Islamic conquests, in a last phase of Roman-Persian warfare, the Persians have also conquered Syria, Palestine, Egypt, taking advantage of that frailty on the part of the East Roman state. That during that first era of Persian occupation, and then during the Arab occupation, those Christian denominations that aren't directly associated with imperial power, because they're outside the imperial church, dramatically expand. So it's not that there are large pre-existing communities who've been alienated, it's that those churchmen are best positioned to recruit new followers in a world where you don't want to be too associated with the ruler of Constantinople against whom your rulers are leading jihad.
We have time for 3 minutes of questions, and I can see many hands going up. First, this gentleman in the front row, then this gentleman with the beard with his black hoodie.
Can you explain about the Justinian's condemnation of the 3 chapters and also the dealing of the resistance by Pope Vigilius?
What was the last bit, sorry?
Pope Vigilius resistance.
Okay, to do that in 3 minutes will be impossible. But essentially what Justinian tries to do is he condemns the writing of those churchmen who are, of several churchmen who his followers in the church have previously supported, because he thinks there are aspects of their argument which, as it were, are erroneous and which make official orthodoxy seem challengeable. He wants to make official orthodoxy seem unchallengeable. He wants to remove the grounds of objection to imperial orthodoxy by removing those writers whose writings seem to him most suspect. Those works are called the 3 chapters. He condemns Pope Vigilius because the Pope refuses to go along with that, so Justinian humiliates him. Now, that's ironic, because also no emperor does more to build up the institution of the papacy than Justinian. That's for another time.
No, forward, that guy here with the black hoodie here. And do we have a question from a woman? At the back, Anne Fraser with her sunglasses on, the final question. Go for it.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, hi Peter, hi William. Today my question is, this is a curious question. I would like to pick both of your brains. So my question is, who would today have a claim to the Roman Empire? Would it be the Charlemagne and the French through Napoleon, because he was crowned as the Emperor of the France? Would it be the Orthodox Christianity and linked to the Russia? Would it be Austrian Habsburg House or the Ottomans? Or would it be I've read somewhere that the rights to the Byzantine Empire was led to Spain's Isabel and Ferdinand?
Peter is a Greek, so will not like any of these options. Would prefer to find the last of the Paleologi in the Mani.
I think the Spanish royal family's claim is via the claim of the kings of Jerusalem to have been Latin rulers of Constantinople. I don't think there's any legitimate claimant to Constantinople after the last emperor is deposed personally. I do, however, find useful the way in which some You know, we talk about the Roman Empire, we talk about a Christian Roman Empire. I think there are periods in time, there are moments when it's useful to think about the early Ottomans as a Muslim Roman Empire, without saying that the Ottomans are legitimate.
They call themselves the Roman Empire.
Indeed, yeah.
The Seljuks of Rum.
And likewise, there is the Russian claim, of course.
But you wouldn't put Prince Philip or any sort of the Greek royal families as a possible claimant to Byzantium. Prince William can't move in and claim Hagia Sophia as his own. Anne.
Thank you very much. I was very impressed by the way you rate Justinian. Would you rate his wife Theodora as highly?
Would you like to have dinner with Theodora?
No.
Yeah, I mean,
choose one of them for a dinner
you don't,
party.
you're not, the trouble with being a historian is you don't necessarily like the people you have to work on. And I think Justinian is a rule of enormous importance, but I wouldn't want to spend any time with him, and I don't think he'd think much of me. Whereas I would very...
You don't go to church nearly
I would
enough.
very happily like to sit down and have a chat with Theodora, because she really is a quite remarkable woman. 'Cause one thing that is quite clear, okay, Procopius says Justinian takes advice off his wife, she influences the laws, she used to be a prostitute, blah, blah, blah. Now, as I say, it's very important that we do have sources that are very pro-Theodora who say, yes, she came from the brothel. The point is that she was forced into it, of course. And one thing and it is also very important to note that in his own legislation, Justinian openly acknowledges that he takes advice from his wife and often takes advice from her first, consults her first, before he consults any chief ministers. He very unusually makes provincial governors swear an oath of loyalty, not just to him, but also to his wife. That's why I think it's very important to think of it during her lifetime. She dies in 548, he rules until 565, as a period of joint rule. Inside Hagia Sophia, not just the emperor's name, but also her name is celebrated in the capital columns that stand there. Now, one thing that's, I think, most striking about Theodora is that when we see her inflecting imperial law, such as to make it easier for women who've been forced onto the stage to escape the stage, or make it easier for illegitimate children to be legitimated, or make it harder for pimps and people traffickers to capture girls, or making it easier for girls to be rescued from brothels. She isn't just doing what lots of Roman emperors done beforehand, of lobbying to feather her own nest, to build up her own estate, and so on. She does a bit of that too. No, she is lobbying to make life better, not just for herself, but people like herself. And women who had gone through similarly hard times, and had seen the rough edge, as it were, had seen the Roman world from the underbelly, who had seen the Constantinople of the brothels and the sex slaves, and not of the church and the holy men. And I think that makes her a really quite remarkable figure.
Saint Theodora.
As she is indeed in the Syrian Orthodox Church, yes.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause, please, for Peter Sarris.